Every pet owner's worst nightmare began with something as simple as a black spot. When Martha Jenkins brought her beloved hound Rex to Dr. Elaine Moritz that Tuesday morning, both women expected nothing more than a routine skin treatment. The spot looked harmless enough. But when Dr. Moritz touched it, the flesh crumbled away like ash, revealing live maggots eating through Rex's nose. An acidic ooze burned right through her medical gloves. 3 days later, the DNA results came back, showing something impossible. The genetic material matched no known species on Earth. When 2 more dogs arrived with the same horrifying symptoms, Dr. Moritz knew this was bigger than anyone could imagine. What kind of parasite could destroy living tissue so quickly and defy all scientific explanation? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk. Dr. Elaine Moritz had always believed that 30 years of veterinary practice had prepared her for anything. The framed license hanging behind her desk in the Millfield Animal Clinic bore witness to 3 decades of dedication, countless late-night emergencies, and the quiet satisfaction that came from healing creatures who couldn't speak for themselves. At 62, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in her characteristic ponytail and laugh lines earned from years of comforting worried pet owners, she had been contemplating retirement more seriously with each passing month. Millfield wasn't the kind of place where dramatic things happened. Nestled in the rolling hills of central Pennsylvania, the town of 4,000 souls thrived on predictability. Main Street still boasted the same hardware store, diner, and pharmacy that had served the community for generations. The surrounding farmland stretched in neat squares of corn and soybeans, broken only by the occasional dairy operation or the newer subdivision that housed commuters willing to drive 40 minutes to the nearest city. This Tuesday morning had started like any other. Elaine arrived at the clinic at 7:30, unlocking the familiar blue door with its cheerful bell that announced every arrival. Sarah Hoffman, her assistant for the past 8 years, had already started the coffee and was reviewing the day's appointments. At 29, Sarah possessed a rare combination of gentle hands and sharp organizational skills that made her invaluable to the practice. "Rex Jenkins is your first appointment," Sarah said, not looking up from the computer screen. "Martha called yesterday evening, worried about some discoloration on his nose. Probably just another case of contact dermatitis from him rooting around in God knows what." Elaine nodded, tying her hair back and washing her hands at the steel sink. Rex was a 12-year-old blue-tick coonhound, gentle as a lamb despite his imposing size. Martha Jenkins had rescued him as a puppy from the county shelter, and the bond between the widow and her dog had been one of those beautiful relationships that reminded Elaine why she'd chosen this profession. The morning routine unfolded with practiced efficiency. Elaine checked on the 2 overnight patients, a cat recovering from spay surgery and an elderly golden retriever being monitored for kidney function, while Sarah prepared the examination rooms. The smell of antiseptic mingled with the underlying warmth of animals, a combination that had become as comforting as home to Elaine over the decades. Martha Jenkins arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, as she always did. At 74, Martha maintained the ramrod posture of a retired schoolteacher, her gray hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Rex padded beside her on his leash, tail wagging with the enthusiasm that had never dimmed despite his advancing years. "Morning, Dr. Moritz," Martha said, settling into the plastic chair in examination room 2. "I'm probably being an old worrywart, but this spot on Rex's nose just appeared overnight, and it looks so dark and angry." Elaine knelt beside Rex, running her experienced hands along his familiar form. The hound's tail thumped against the examination table as she checked his eyes, ears, and lymph nodes. Everything seemed normal until she examined the area Martha had mentioned. There, on the left side of Rex's black nose, was indeed a spot of deeper darkness, not the healthy black of his natural pigmentation, but something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "How long since you first noticed this?" Elaine asked, gently turning Rex's head to get a better look. "Yesterday evening when he came in from his walk. It wasn't there in the morning when I let him out. I'm certain of that. Rex and I have our routines, and I always check him over after his walks." The spot was roughly the size of a dime, perfectly circular, with slightly raised edges. What troubled Elaine wasn't its appearance. She'd seen plenty of skin abnormalities over the years, but something she couldn't quite articulate. There was a quality to it that made her professional instincts whisper warnings. "Let me take a closer look," she said, reaching for her magnifying glass and PENLIGHT dot under magnification. The spot revealed an almost crystalline structure, as if the tissue had been transformed into something else entirely. The surface appeared both organic and somehow artificial, with tiny geometric patterns that caught the light in unusual ways. Elaine had never seen anything quite like it. "I'm going to take a small tissue sample," she told Martha. "It's probably nothing serious, but I'd like to have it analyzed at the state lab just to be thorough. The biopsy should have been routine." Elaine had performed thousands over her career, but as the small punch biopsy tool made contact with the lesion, something unexpected happened. The tissue didn't cut, it crumbled. Like touching ash from a long-dead fire, the surface simply collapsed inward, revealing a cavity that shouldn't have existed. That was when she saw them. Tiny white larvae, no bigger than grains of rice, writhed in the exposed hollow. But these weren't ordinary maggots. They moved with a purpose that seemed almost intelligent, and where they touched the surrounding healthy tissue, that same dark transformation began to spread. Elaine's stomach lurched, but her professional training kept her hands steady. She'd seen parasitic infections before, though nothing quite like this. What made her pause wasn't just the unusual larvae, it was the acidic smell that rose from the wound, sharp and chemical, like battery acid mixed with decay. "What is it?" Martha asked, her voice tight with worry. "I'm not entirely sure," Elaine admitted, reaching for sterile forceps. "Some kind of parasitic infection, but I've never seen larvae quite like these." As she attempted to remove one of the organisms for examination, her latex glove began to smoke. The acidic secretions from the larvae were actually burning through the protective barrier. Elaine quickly changed gloves and used metal instruments to collect samples, her mind racing through her knowledge of parasitology. Whimpered softly but remained still, trusting the woman who had cared for him throughout his adult life. Martha stroked his head, murmuring comforting words while watching Elaine work with growing concern. "I'm going to start him a broad-spectrum antibiotic and an anti-parasitic medication," Elaine said, preparing the injections. "I'll rush these samples to the State Veterinary Diagnostic Lab and have preliminary results by tomorrow." After Martha and Rex left, Elaine found herself staring at the tissue samples in their sterile containers. Something about this case felt different, important in a way that went beyond routine medical practice. She labeled the samples carefully and prepared them for overnight delivery to the state lab, including a detailed description of what she'd observed. The rest of the morning passed normally, but Elaine couldn't shake the image of those larvae and the way the healthy tissue had simply crumbled away. During her lunch break, she found herself researching parasitic infections online, searching for anything that matched what she'd seen. The closest matches were certain tropical parasites, but none that could cause such rapid tissue destruction. Her personal life had been quieter in recent years, especially since the rift with her son David 3 years ago. David had been a promising microbiologist, following in the intellectual footsteps that made Elaine proud. But his career had ended in scandal when his unauthorized genetic experiments at the university had been discovered. The ethical violations had cost him his position, his reputation, and ultimately, their relationship. The irony wasn't lost on her that David's expertise in microbiology and parasitology might be exactly what she needed now. But pride and hurt had built walls between them that seemed impossible to bridge. She hadn't spoken to her son since the awkward Christmas dinner where his bitterness about his ruined career had poisoned every conversation. As the afternoon wore on, Elaine tried to focus on her regular patient's routine vaccinations, a cat with an ear infection, a puppy's wellness check. But her thoughts kept returning to Rex and those impossible larvae. She'd sent photos along with the tissue samples, hoping the lab would have answers. The phone call came just as she was preparing to close the clinic for the day. Dr. Moritz? This is Dr. Patricia Williams at the State Diagnostic Lab. I'm calling about the samples you sent from the canine patient. Already? I wasn't expecting results until tomorrow. That's why I'm calling. These samples are unlike anything we've seen. The tissue structure is completely abnormal, and the organisms you collected, we've never encountered anything like them. Dr. Moritz, I think you need to contact the Centers for Disease Control immediately. Elaine's hand tightened on the phone. The CDC? Are you saying this is infectious to humans? I'm saying we don't know what this is, and that scares me more than I care to admit. The genetic sequencing is showing results that don't match any known species in our databases. It's as if these organisms contain DNA from sources that shouldn't exist. After hanging up, Elaine sat in her empty clinic as evening shadows lengthened across the examination rooms. 30 years of practice, and she'd never encountered anything that had prompted a recommendation to call the CDC. Whatever was happening to Rex wasn't just unusual, it was potentially catastrophic. Outside, Millfield continued its peaceful evening routine. Families gathered for dinner, children played in front yards, and the familiar rhythms of small town life continued unchanged. But Elaine knew that by tomorrow, everything might be different. She thought again of David, of his expertise in genetic research and microbiology, of the skills that might be crucial in understanding what they were facing. Pride was a luxury she might not be able to afford much longer. The call came at 2:17 in the morning. Elaine jolted awake to the shrill sound of her cell phone, immediately knowing that no good news ever arrived at such an hour. Martha Jenkins' voice was barely recognizable through her sobs. Dr. Moritz, you have to come. Rex is, oh God. Please come now. Elaine threw on clothes and drove through the empty streets of Millfield, her headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Martha's farmhouse sat on 3 acres at the edge of town, a modest white colonial surrounded by the garden that had been her pride since retirement. The porch light cast a yellow circle of illumination where Martha stood in her robe, clutching a tissue. Rex lay on his favorite blanket in the living room. But what Elaine saw made her stomach clench with professional horror and personal grief. The black spot had spread across half of the dog's muzzle overnight, and the tissue destruction was unlike anything in her experience. Where healthy pink nose leather should have been, there was only a hollow cavity lined with those terrible larvae. The acidic smell filled the room. He was fine when we went to bed, Martha whispered. I checked on him around midnight, and he seemed comfortable. But when I got up for water an hour ago, Rex's breathing was labored, and his eyes held the distant look that Elaine had learned to recognize after 3 decades of practice. There would be no recovering from this. Whatever these organisms were, they had progressed beyond any possibility of treatment. Martha, Elaine said gently, kneeling beside the dying dog, I think it's time. The euthanasia was peaceful, as it always was when performed with compassion and skill. Rex passed quietly in Martha's arms, finally free from whatever torment had ravaged his body. But even in death, the larvae continued their grotesque work, the destruction spreading visibly across the surrounding tissue. What did this to him? Martha asked through her tears. In 40 years of having dogs, I've never seen anything like this. Elaine couldn't answer because she didn't know. But she carefully collected tissue samples from the affected area, double bagging them in biohazard containers. Whatever had killed Rex needed to be studied, understood, and stopped before it could affect other animals. By 7 in the morning, Elaine was back at the clinic, sending urgent emails to the state lab and preparing detailed documentation of Rex's rapid decline. The photos she'd taken showed the progression with clinical clarity, but they couldn't capture the horror of watching tissues simply dissolve away. Sarah arrived to find her employer already deep in research. Medical journals spread across the desk alongside printouts of exotic parasitic diseases. Any luck identifying what we're dealing with? Sarah asked, starting the coffee with practiced efficiency. Nothing. I've been through every parasitology text I can find, and there's no precedent for this rate of tissue destruction. The state lab wants me to send everything to the CDC in Atlanta. The morning brought 2 more cases. Mrs. Henderson arrived at 9 with Bella, her 3-year-old tabby cat. The black spot on Bella's front paw was identical to what Elaine had seen on Rex, perfectly circular, with that same light-absorbing quality that made it appear deeper than the surrounding tissue. It appeared yesterday evening, Mrs. Henderson explained, her voice tight with worry. Bella's been acting strange, not eating much, and she keeps licking at the spot. Before Elaine could complete her examination, Tom Bradley arrived with Murphy, his 8-year-old Jack Russell Terrier. The black lesion on Murphy's rear leg was larger than the others, suggesting it had been present longer. How long has this been developing? Elaine asked the police chief. I first noticed it 3 days ago, Tom admitted. Thought it was just a scrape from when he got into the brush behind the house. But it's been growing, and now it smells terrible. 3 cases in 4 days, all presenting with identical symptoms. This wasn't coincidence. This was an outbreak. Elaine called the state health department immediately, reaching Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the regional epidemiologist. Dr. Moritz, I received your preliminary report about the canine case. 3 additional animals with identical symptoms changes everything. We need to establish a quarantine protocol immediately. Quarantine for what? We still don't know what we're dealing with. That's exactly why we need quarantine. Unknown pathogen, rapid progression, potential for zoonotic transmission. This is all the markers of a significant biological threat. But when Dr. Martinez contacted the state veterinary office and the local health authorities, the response was frustratingly bureaucratic. Forms needed to be filled out, protocols had to be followed, and budget approvals were required before any emergency measures could be implemented. They're treating this like routine paperwork, Elaine told Sarah after hanging up from her 3rd call to state officials. They don't understand what we're seeing here. The local newspaper picked up the story by noon. Jenny Walsh, the Millfield Gazette's only reporter, had heard about the mysterious pet deaths through the small-town gossip network that was more efficient than any official communication system. 3 pets dead or dying from some unknown disease, Jenny said, her pen poised over her notebook. Dr. Moritz, should pet owners be worried? Elaine chose her words carefully. Creating panic wouldn't help anyone, but ignoring the threat could be catastrophic. We're investigating an unusual parasitic infection that's affected several local animals. Pet owners should monitor their animals closely and contact me immediately if they notice any unusual skin lesions or behavioral changes. By evening, the story had been shared dozens of times on Facebook, and Elaine's phone was ringing constantly. Half the calls were from worried pet owners describing every minor scratch or bump on their animals. The other half were from regional veterinarians asking for more details about the symptoms. It was during one of these calls that Elaine made the decision she'd been avoiding for 3 years. David answered on the fourth ring, his voice carrying the wariness that had characterized their few interactions since his career collapse. "Mom? Is everything okay?" "David, I need your help. There's something happening here in Millfield, something that involves genetics and parasitology, and I'm in over my head." She described the cases, the impossible tissue destruction, the larvae that seemed to defy classification. David listened without interruption, and she could hear his scientific mind engaging with the puzzle despite their personal history. "You said the DNA sequencing showed unknown genetic material?" "That's what the state lab told me. They've never seen anything like it." "Mom, that's impossible. Every known organism on Earth shares common genetic markers. If the sequencing is showing truly unknown material, what does that mean?" David was quiet for a long moment. "It means either the testing equipment is malfunctioning, or we're dealing with something that shouldn't exist. Either way, I'll be there tomorrow." After hanging up, Elaine sat in her quiet clinic, surrounded by the familiar tools and equipment that had defined her professional life. Outside, Millfield continued its evening routine, unaware that their world might be changing in ways none of them could imagine. She thought about Rex, about the trust in his eyes, even as his body was being destroyed by something science couldn't explain. She thought about Martha's grief, about Mrs. Henderson's worry for Bella, about Tom Bradley's growing concern for Murphy. Most of all, she thought about the phone call she'd just made to her estranged son, reaching across 3 years of hurt and pride, because the need for answers had become more important than family grudges. Whatever was happening in Millfield, it was bigger than anything she could handle alone. Tomorrow, David would arrive, and together they would try to solve a mystery that threatened not just the local pet population, but potentially every living thing in their small town. The samples from Bella and Murphy sat in their sterile containers on her laboratory bench, waiting for analysis. In the morning, she would send them to the CDC along with Rex's tissue samples and her growing file of documentation. But tonight, for the first time in her 30-year career, Dr. Elaine Moritz went home genuinely afraid of what tomorrow might bring. David Moritz arrived in Millfield, driving the same battered Honda Civic he'd owned since graduate school, a vehicle that had once symbolized academic poverty, but now represented something more painful: professional exile. At 34, he carried himself with the careful posture of someone who had learned not to draw attention, his dark hair longer than it had been during his university days, his clothes deliberately unremarkable. Elaine watched him park outside the clinic through the window of examination room 2, her emotions a complex mixture of relief, anxiety, and 3 years of accumulated hurt. The last time they'd spoken face-to-face, angry words had been exchanged about ethics, responsibility, and the difference between scientific advancement and reckless experimentation. "Dr. Moritz?" Sarah's voice from the front desk carried a note of uncertainty. "There's a man here to see you. Says he's your son." The reunion was awkward, formal, laden with the weight of unresolved conflict. David's handshake was firm but brief, his eyes taking in the familiar surroundings of the clinic where he'd spent countless childhood hours, learning to love science by watching his mother heal animals with equal parts knowledge and compassion. "Thank you for coming," Elaine said, her professional demeanor a shield against the emotional complexity of the moment. "You said this involved unknown genetic material. That's not something I could ignore, regardless of," he gestured vaguely, encompassing their shared history of disappointment and resentment. Sarah tactfully found urgent paperwork to complete in the back room, leaving mother and son alone with the tissue samples that had prompted this uncomfortable reunion. David donned gloves and safety glasses with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years working with biological specimens. "Walk me through what you've observed," he said, adjusting the microscope settings with familiar expertise. Elaine described each case in clinical detail, her professional training allowing her to set aside personal feelings and focus on the scientific puzzle before them. David listened with the intense concentration she remembered from his childhood, when he would absorb every word during their discussions about biology and medicine. The tissue destruction pattern is unlike anything in standard parasitology texts, she concluded, and the rate of progression Rex went from initial lesion to death in less than 72 hours. David examined the specimens under high magnification, his expression growing increasingly troubled. The larvae were unlike any parasite he'd encountered in his years of genetic research, their cellular structure displaying characteristics that seemed to blend organic and synthetic elements. "Mom, these organisms, they're not following normal biological rules. Look at this cellular wall structure." He adjusted the microscope so she could see. "That's not chitin, not cellulose, not any organic polymer I recognize. It's as if someone took natural parasitic organisms and engineered them at the molecular level." The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. David's expertise in genetic modification was both the reason Elaine had called him and the source of the ethical violations that had destroyed his career. 3 years ago, his unauthorized experiments with parasitic DNA had been discovered by university administrators, leading to his immediate dismissal and a career-ending reputation as a scientist who couldn't be trusted with ethical boundaries. "You think these are engineered organisms?" Elaine asked. "I think they show characteristics consistent with genetic modification, but at a level of sophistication that's beyond current technology. The integration of synthetic elements with organic structures. This represents work that's decades ahead of anything I've seen." Sarah returned with fresh coffee and the morning appointment schedule, her presence helping to normalize the tension between mother and son. She'd worked with Elaine long enough to understand family dynamics, and her easy acceptance of David helped break some of the awkwardness. "Any word from the CDC about the samples you sent?" David asked. "They received them yesterday, but said preliminary analysis would take at least 48 hours. Standard bureaucratic timeline that doesn't account for the urgency of what we're first dealing with." David's research journal lay open on the examination table, filled with detailed sketches and notes about the parasitic organisms. His handwriting was the same careful script Elaine remembered from his childhood, but the content revealed a depth of knowledge that had grown far beyond what she'd understood about his work. "During my graduate research, I studied parasitic adaptation mechanisms," he said, his voice taking on the professorial tone that had once made his professors describe him as brilliant. "Most parasites evolve slowly, adapting to their hosts over generations. But these organisms appear to be adapting in real time, almost as if they're programmed to overcome biological defenses." The morning brought 2 more appointments that seemed routine until examined more carefully. A border collie with what appeared to be a minor cut on his paw, and a Persian cat with a small dark spot behind her ear. Both lesions showed the telltale characteristics they were learning to recognize: the light-absorbing quality, the perfect circular shape, the subtle acidic odor. "That's 5 cases in less than a week," Elaine said as they documented the new patients. "We're looking at an outbreak, not isolated incidents." David spread a map of Millfield across the examination table, marking the locations where each affected animal lived. The pattern that emerged was immediately obvious. All 5 cases fell within a roughly 2-mile radius of a specific area on the eastern edge of town. "There's your common source," he said, pointing to the cluster of marks. "Something in this geographic area is the origin point for the contamination." Sarah joined them at the map, her local knowledge proving invaluable. "That's mostly farmland out there, and some older residential areas. Nothing that would obviously explain a disease outbreak. Any industrial activity? Chemical plants, research?" Facilities? Anything that might involve biological materials? David asked. There used to be something, Sarah said thoughtfully. When I was a kid, there was some kind of factory or laboratory out that way. It closed down years ago, though. My dad always said it was some kind of chemical processing plant that got shut down for environmental violations. David and Elaine exchanged glances. Environmental contamination could certainly explain an outbreak of unknown organisms, especially if the contamination involved experimental biological agents. We need to investigate that area, David said. If there's a contaminated site that's serving as a breeding ground for these parasites, it would explain both the geographic clustering and the unusual characteristics of the organisms. The conversation was interrupted by a phone call from Dr. Martinez at the State Health Department. Her voice carried a new urgency that hadn't been present in their previous conversations. Dr. Moritz, we've had 3 more reports of similar cases from veterinarians in surrounding counties. This isn't limited to Millfield anymore. Elaine felt her stomach tighten. How far has it spread? Cases reported in 3 towns within a 30-mile radius, all showing identical symptoms to what you've described. We're implementing emergency protocols as of this afternoon. After the call, the clinic felt smaller, more confined. What had begun as a local veterinary mystery was expanding into something with regional implications. David's expertise, which had once seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford, now felt essential to their survival. I never thought I'd say this, Elaine admitted, but I'm grateful for your background in genetic research, even if the way you acquired it was unethical, David finished. I know. I've had 3 years to think about what I did wrong and why scientific ethics exist. But maybe that experience, however badly acquired, can help us understand what we're facing now. The afternoon brought a steady stream of worried pet owners, some with animals showing early symptoms, others simply terrified by the growing rumors spreading through the community. Each case required careful examination, documentation, and the increasingly difficult task of explaining a situation that defied easy answers by closing time. They had confirmed 2 additional cases and collected tissue samples from both. The geographic pattern held every affected animal lived within that same 2-mile radius that seemed to center on the abandoned industrial area Sarah had mentioned. Tomorrow we investigate the source, David said, packing his research materials into a worn messenger bag. Whatever's out there, it's the key to understanding these organisms. Elaine nodded, watching her son prepare to leave. 3 years of silence and resentment hadn't disappeared, but they'd been set aside in the face of a larger threat. For the first time since his disgrace, David's scientific skills were being used for something unquestionably beneficial. David, she said as he reached the door, I'm glad you came. He paused, his hand on the doorknob. I'm glad you called. Despite everything that's happened between us, I never stopped respecting what you do here. After he left, Elaine remained in the clinic, updating her case files and preparing tissue samples for overnight shipment to the CDC. Outside, Millfield settled into another peaceful evening, but she knew that peace was fragile. Whatever was growing in that contaminated area on the edge of town wasn't going to remain contained much longer. The Millfield Community Center hadn't seen a crowd like this since the heated school board meetings of 2019. Mayor Robert Sterling stood at the front of the room, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain, his tie slightly askew, his graying hair less perfectly styled than usual. Behind him, a PowerPoint presentation displayed sanitized bullet points about minor animal health concerns and ongoing investigations. Elaine sat in the 3rd row, David beside her, watching. Sterling attempted to downplay a situation that was growing more serious by the hour. The mayor's political instincts had served him well during his 8 years in office, but this crisis demanded more than smooth talking and careful deflection. The state veterinary office assures me that this is an isolated incident affecting a small number of animals, Sterling was saying, his voice carrying the practiced calm of someone accustomed to managing public perception. Dr. Moritz and her team are working with state authorities to identify the cause and implement appropriate treatment protocols. Martha Jenkins stood from her seat near the front, her grief giving her voice a trembling authority that cut through Sterling's political polish. "Mr. Mayor, my Rex died in agony from whatever this thing is. Don't you dare call it a minor concern." A murmur of support rippled through the crowd. Other pet owners nodded, their faces reflecting growing anxiety about animals they'd noticed acting strangely or showing early symptoms. Tom Bradley, still in his police uniform from the day shift, shifted uncomfortably as several people turned to look at Murphy, who waited in the police cruiser outside. "Mrs. Jenkins, I understand your grief," Sterling replied, "but creating panic won't help our situation. We have veterinary professionals and state health officials working to—" "How many more animals have to die before you admit this is serious?" interrupted Janet Morrison, whose golden retriever had been one of the morning's new cases. "My Lucy is barely eating, and there's something wrong with her skin that looks exactly like what killed Rex." Elaine felt the responsibility of her professional position weighing heavily as the crowd's attention turned toward her. These people trusted her with their animals' lives, and now they needed honest answers about a situation that defied conventional medical understanding. "What we're seeing is definitely serious," she said, standing to address the room. "The organism causing these infections is unlike anything in standard veterinary medicine. We're working with the CDC and state laboratories to identify exactly what we're dealing with. Is it contagious to humans?" asked Mike Henderson, his arm protectively around his wife's shoulders. "Our cat Bella is sick, and my kids have been playing with her every day." The question that everyone wanted answered, but that no one had dared ask aloud. Elaine glanced at David, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his expression. "We don't have definitive answers about human transmission yet," she admitted. "As a precaution, I recommend minimizing contact with affected animals and maintaining strict hygiene protocols if you must handle them." Sterling's carefully prepared talking points were dissolving in the face of genuine community fear. His political advisors had probably counseled minimizing the threat to avoid economic panic, but the reality in the room was that people needed truth, not spin. After the meeting, Sterling approached Elaine and David in the parking lot, his public persona giving way to genuine concern. "Dr. Moritz, I need to know exactly what we're dealing with. The State Tourism Board is already asking questions about whether we should cancel the Harvest Festival next month. If this spreads, or if there's human transmission, then you should be more worried about public health than tourism revenue," David said, his tone sharper than necessary. Sterling's eyes narrowed as he studied David. "You're the son, aren't you? The one who got fired from the university for unethical research." "That's right. And that experience taught me what happens when scientific integrity gets compromised by other considerations. Whatever's happening here is bigger than your political concerns." Elaine stepped between them before the conversation could deteriorate further. "Mayor Sterling, we need to investigate the old industrial area on the eastern edge of town. Every affected animal has lived within 2 miles of that location." "That's private property," Sterling said quickly. "You can't just go wandering around out there without permission from the landowners." "Then get us permission," David said. "Because if that's the source of contamination, every day we delay means more animals infected and potentially human cases developing." The drive to the suspected contamination site took them through the older section of Millfield, where farmhouses from the 1950s sat on larger lots that had once been purely agricultural. David navigated using GPS coordinates while Elaine consulted the hand-drawn map Sarah had provided. Based on her childhood memories of the area, the road ended at a chain-link fence topped with rusted barbed wire. Beyond the barrier, they could see the remains of what had once been a substantial industrial complex, concrete foundations overgrown with weeds. The skeletal remains of several large buildings and a series of concrete settling ponds that had been empty for decades. Definitely abandoned, David observed, photographing the site through the fence. But look at the vegetation patterns. Elaine followed his gaze and saw what he meant. The plant growth was distinctly uneven, with areas of unusual coloration and stunted development that suggested ongoing soil contamination. More troubling were the dead zones where nothing grew at all, circular patches of bare earth that reminded her uncomfortably of the lesions they'd been seeing on infected animals. An elderly woman emerged from a nearby farmhouse, walking slowly but deliberately toward them. She was perhaps 80, with the weathered hands and practical clothing of someone who had worked the land for decades. "You folks looking at the old Sterling chemical plant?" she asked, her voice carrying the distinctive accent of longtime Pennsylvania residents. "Sterling Chemical?" Elaine repeated. "As in Mayor Sterling? His father's company," the woman confirmed. "Agnes Whitmore," she added, extending a hand that was surprisingly strong despite her age. "I've lived next to that mess for 40 years, watching it poison everything around here." David introduced himself and Elaine, explaining their investigation into the animal infections. Agnes listened with the careful attention of someone accustomed to keeping her own counsel. "You think that old plant is connected to the sick animals?" she asked. "The geographic pattern suggests it," Elaine said. "Every infected animal has lived within a 2-mile radius of this location." Agnes was quiet for a long moment, studying the abandoned facility with eyes that held decades of memory. There were problems when that plant was operating. Workers getting sick, animals in the area dying mysteriously. The company claimed it was all coincidence, but those of us who lived here knew better. What kind of chemicals were they processing? David asked. That's what nobody would ever say. Government contracts, they claimed. Classified work that couldn't be discussed with the community. But I saw the trucks coming and going, the hazmat suits on the workers, the way they burned everything. That came out of those buildings. David and Elaine exchanged glances. Government contracts involving classified biological work could explain the sophisticated nature of the organisms they'd been studying. "Mrs. Whitmore," Elaine said carefully, "do you know why the plant was shut down?" "Environmental violations," they said in the newspaper. But it happened awful sudden. One day they were operating normally. The next day there were federal agents swarming the place and everything shut down permanently. Agnes pointed toward a section of the facility where the concrete foundations were darkly stained. They spent months after the shutdown doing some kind of cleanup. Men in white suits scrubbing everything down and hauling away truckloads of contaminated soil. But you can't clean up everything, especially when it's soaked into the groundwater. David was taking notes rapidly, his scientific training recognizing the significance of what they were learning. "Mrs. Whitmore, have you noticed any unusual animal deaths or illnesses in the area over the years since the plant closed?" "Now and then," she admitted. "Usually written off as natural causes or exposure to farm chemicals. But thinking back, there have been patterns clusters of sick animals every few years, always in the same general area." As they talked, Elaine noticed movement near one of the abandoned buildings. A figure in work clothes was walking among the ruins, apparently conducting some kind of inspection. The person was too far away to identify, but their presence suggested the site wasn't as abandoned as it appeared. "Someone's been maintaining that place," David observed. Following her gaze, Agnes squinted toward the figure. "That'll be one of Sterling's people. The mayor has had crews out there regularly over the years, doing what he calls environmental monitoring. Always claimed it was required by the state. But I never saw any state vehicles. The implications were troubling. If Mayor Sterling had..." been secretly monitoring the contaminated site for years. It suggested he knew far more about the potential dangers than he'd revealed at the community meeting. "We need to get inside that facility," David said. "If there's ongoing contamination that's creating these organisms, we need samples from the source." "That's trespassing," Agnes warned. "Sterling's had people arrested for going in there without permission." "Then we get permission," Elaine said. "Or we find another way to investigate what's really happening." The afternoon brought disturbing news from the clinic. Sarah called while they were driving back to town, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Dr. Moritz, you need to get back here immediately. We've had 3 more cases come in, and one of them is different." "Different how?" "It's a human case. Jimmy Kowalski, the homeless man who camps near the old industrial area. Tom Bradley brought him in because he's showing symptoms identical to what we've seen in the animals." Elaine's stomach clenched. The possibility they'd all been dreading, human transmission, had just become reality. Jimmy Kowalski was waiting in examination room 3, his weathered face showing the effects of years of outdoor living complicated by obvious illness. The lesion on his left hand was unmistakably the same type they'd been seeing in animals. The characteristic black coloration, the perfect circular shape, the acidic odor that meant tissue destruction was already advanced. "Jimmy," Elaine said, gently, "how long have you had this mark on your hand?" "Couple days, maybe," he said, his voice hoarse from years of poor health and limited medical care. "Woke up with it after sleeping rough near the old chemical place. Thought it was just a scrape at first." David examined the lesion with the same careful attention he'd given to the animal cases. But the implications were far more serious. Human physiology was different from that of cats and dogs. If the organisms could adapt to human hosts, the potential for widespread transmission was catastrophic. "Jimmy, I need to ask you to go to the hospital," Elaine said. "This infection needs immediate medical attention." "Can't afford no hospital," Jimmy protested. "Just give me some antibiotics or something." "This isn't about money," David interjected. "This is about saving your life and preventing the spread of a dangerous infection." They called for an ambulance, but when the EMTs arrived, they were reluctant to transport a patient with an unknown infectious disease. It took calls to the state health department and the promise of federal backing before Jimmy could be taken to Millfield General Hospital for isolation and treatment. As evening approached, Elaine and David found themselves alone in the clinic, confronting the reality that their investigation had taken on life-or-death urgency. Human transmission meant the situation was no longer a veterinary problem. It was a public health crisis. "We need to get into that facility tonight," David said, studying the photographs they'd taken of the Sterling chemical site. "If there's an active source of contamination that's producing these organisms, every hour we delay means more potential exposure. That's breaking and entering," Elaine pointed out. "That's saving lives," David countered. "Jimmy won't be the last human case unless we identify the source and figure out how to neutralize it." The decision felt both inevitable and terrifying. 30 years of practicing veterinary medicine had never prepared Elaine for the possibility that she might need to become an investigator. But the alternative, watching helplessly as more animals and humans became infected, was unacceptable. Outside, Millfield settled into another evening routine, but the normalcy was increasingly fragile. Tomorrow's newspaper would carry the story of the first human case, and the community's growing fear would be replaced by genuine panic. In her clinic, surrounded by the tools and knowledge that had defined her professional life, Dr. Elaine Moritz prepared to cross lines she'd never imagined crossing, because the mystery that had begun with a simple black spot on a dog's nose was threatening to become something much larger and more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The Sterling chemical site looked different under cover of darkness. What had appeared merely abandoned during their afternoon reconnaissance now seemed actively menacing. with shadows that suggested movement and the constant sound of settling metal that could mask approaching footsteps. David had brought a portable soil testing kit and sample containers, while Elaine carried a powerful flashlight and her veterinary emergency bag. They entered through a gap in the fence that Agnes had mentioned, where decades of weather had loosened the chain link enough to allow passage. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, scattered with debris from the demolished buildings and patches of that unnaturally bare earth they'd observed from outside. "Stay close and don't touch anything directly," David warned, pulling on heavy-duty gloves and handing a pair to his mother. "If this site is producing the organisms we've been seeing, the contamination could be anywhere." Their flashlight beams revealed the remnants of what had once been a sophisticated operation. Concrete pads marked where large equipment had been installed, and a network of underground pipes suggested chemical processing on an industrial scale. Most disturbing were the settling pond's large concrete basins that should have been empty, but instead contained dark, oily water that reflected their lights with an unnatural iridescence. David knelt beside the nearest pond, using a long-handled sampling tool to collect water without direct contact. The liquid had an acidic smell that reminded them both of the odor from infected animals, and small bubbles rising to the surface suggested ongoing biological activity. "There's definitely something alive in here," he said, sealing the water sample in a sterile container. "Microorganisms that are producing gas as a metabolic byproduct." Elaine was examining the soil around the pond's perimeter when her flashlight caught something that made her freeze. In the beam of light, she could see movement, not the random stirring of insects or small animals, but the purposeful motion of something larger. "David," she whispered urgently. He followed her gaze and saw them two larvae identical to what they'd found in the infected animals. But these were larger and moving across the contaminated soil in coordinated patterns that suggested a level of organization that individual parasites shouldn't possess. "They're not acting like normal parasites," David said, his voice tight with scientific fascination and growing alarm. "Look at the movement patterns. They're exhibiting collective behavior, almost like colonial organisms." They collected soil samples from several locations, each revealing the same disturbing evidence of organized parasitic activity. The organisms seemed to be most concentrated around the settling ponds, suggesting the contaminated water was serving as both breeding ground and food source. "We need to get these samples to a laboratory immediately," Elaine said. "Whatever's happening here, it's far beyond what we can analyze with basic equipment." The sound of an approaching vehicle made them freeze. Headlights swept across the facility as a pickup truck drove slowly along the perimeter road, its occupant apparently conducting a routine security patrol. David and Elaine crouched behind a concrete barrier, waiting for the vehicle to pass. "Someone's definitely monitoring this place," David whispered. "And given what we've found, they have to know about the contamination." They made their way back to the fence gap without incident, but the implications of what they'd discovered weighed heavily as they drove back toward town. The Sterling chemical site wasn't just an abandoned facility. It was an active biological hazard that had been concealed from the community for decades. Back at the clinic, David set up an improvised laboratory using Elaine's microscope and the portable testing equipment he'd brought from his apartment. The water samples revealed a complex ecosystem of microorganisms, many showing the same blend of organic and synthetic characteristics they'd observed in the parasitic larvae. "This isn't natural contamination," he said, adjusting the microscope focus to get a clearer view of the organisms. "These show clear signs of genetic modification, synthetic DNA sequences that don't occur in nature." Elaine was preparing the soil samples when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Millfield General Hospital, and she answered with growing dread. "Dr. Moritz, this is Dr. Sarah Chun in the emergency department. We need you here immediately. Your patient, Jimmy Kowalski, has taken a turn for the worse." Jimmy's condition had deteriorated rapidly since his admission 6 hours earlier. The lesion on his hand had spread up his forearm, and new spots were appearing on his chest and neck. More troubling, his blood work showed massive systemic infection that wasn't responding to broad-spectrum antibiotics. It's like his immune system can't recognize the organisms as foreign, Dr. Chen explained as they stood outside Jimmy's isolation room. Every treatment we've tried has been ineffective. Through the observation window, they could see Jimmy lying unconscious, his body ravaged by an infection that seemed to be rewriting his biology at the cellular level. David studied the patient's chart, his expression growing increasingly grim. "The progression is exponential," he said. "In animals, we saw rapid tissue destruction localized to the infection site. In humans, it appears the organisms are spreading systemically through the bloodstream." "Are you saying this is more dangerous to humans than to animals?" Elaine asked. "I'm saying human physiology might be providing these organisms with opportunities for adaptation that other species don't offer. They're not just parasitizing human tissue. They're learning from it." Dr. Chen pulled them aside as more medical staff arrived to monitor Jimmy's deteriorating condition. "Dr. Moritz, I need to know everything about potential transmission. We've had 3 staff members develop skin irritation after contact with the patient, despite full protective protocols." The possibility of hospital transmission was terrifying. If the organisms could spread through casual contact, even with protective equipment, the potential for epidemic was enormous. "We need to implement maximum containment immediately," David said. "Full isolation, hazmat protocols, and immediate testing of any potentially exposed individuals." As they worked through the night, coordinating with hospital staff and state health authorities, more disturbing news arrived. Agnes Whitmore called Elaine's cell phone at 3 in the morning, her voice shaking with fear. "Dr. Moritz, I've been getting phone calls all evening. Someone's been calling and hanging up, and when I do answer, they tell me to keep quiet about what I told you today." "Who's calling you, Mrs. Whitmore?" "They won't say, but the caller ID shows a Millfield number. Someone in town doesn't want me talking about the old chemical plant." The threats against Agnes suggested their investigation was making people nervous. People with something to hide about the Sterling chemical facility and its ongoing contamination. David made a note to follow up on the caller ID information, but their immediate priority was understanding the organisms they were dealing with. By dawn, they had preliminary results from their improvised analysis. The water and soil samples contained what David estimated to be dozens of different parasitic species, all showing evidence of genetic modification, and all capable of rapid adaptation to new host environments. "This isn't an accidental contamination," he told Elaine as they reviewed their findings. "Someone deliberately created these organisms, probably as part of a biological weapons research program." "Biological weapons?" The implications were staggering. "You're saying someone weaponized parasites?" "It's the only explanation that fits the evidence. Natural parasites don't show this level of genetic sophistication or this capacity for rapid host adaptation. These were engineered to be weapons, and somehow they've been contained at that facility for decades." As morning brought new cases, 2 more pets and a second human patient, who had also been camping near the chemical plant, Elaine realized they were facing something far more dangerous than a medical mystery. They were dealing with escaped biological weapons that were learning to exploit human hosts, and someone in Millfield had been covering up that threat for 30 years. The question was whether they could identify the responsible parties and develop effective countermeasures before the organisms spread beyond their ability to contain them. David's laptop screen glowed in the pre-dawn darkness of Elaine's kitchen as he navigated through archived databases that most people didn't know existed. His university credentials had been revoked, but 3 years of exile had taught him alternative ways to access scientific information, including military research archives that weren't supposed to be accessible to civilians. "Mom, look at this," he said, turning the screen so Elaine could see the document he'd uncovered. Sterling Chemical Industries, Pentagon Contract 7439B, dated 1983. Research and development of biological agents for tactical deployment. The document was heavily redacted, with entire paragraphs blacked out, but the visible portions were damning. Sterling Chemical had been contracted to develop parasitic organisms that could be deployed against enemy forces, creating debilitating infections that would incapacitate rather than kill, at least in theory. Biological warfare, Elaine said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. They were developing biological warfare agents right here in Millfield. Gets worse, David said, scrolling through additional files. Look at the project leader's name. Dr. Robert Sterling, Sr. Mayor Sterling's father, had been the chief scientist on the biological weapons program. The current mayor hadn't just inherited a contaminated site. He'd inherited knowledge of exactly what was buried there, and why it was dangerous. Elaine's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Stop digging or you'll find more than you bargained for. She showed the message to David, who immediately began trying to trace the sender. Someone's definitely watching our investigation. The question is whether they're trying to protect the cover-up or protect the community from something even worse. At Millfield General Hospital, Jimmy Kowalski's condition had stabilized overnight, but not in a way that provided comfort. The parasitic infection had stopped spreading, but it had also begun transforming his tissue in ways that defied medical understanding. Areas of infected skin were developing the same synthetic characteristics David had observed in the laboratory. Specimens. It's like the organisms are rewriting his cellular structure, Dr. Chun explained as they reviewed the latest test results. His DNA is being modified in real time by parasitic enzymes that shouldn't exist. The second human patient, a middle-aged woman named Carol Peterson, who had been hiking near the chemical plant, was showing similar symptoms but with different progression patterns. Where Jimmy's infection was transforming tissue, Carol's was affecting her nervous system, causing hallucinations and episodes of apparent telepathic awareness of the parasitic organisms. She claimed she can sense where other infected animals are located, Dr. Chun said. She's been providing accurate information about pets in the area that haven't been diagnosed yet. David found this information particularly troubling. If the organisms are creating neural connections between hosts, we're looking at the possibility of a hive mind developing. These parasites might be more than weapons. They could be designed for control. Agnes Whitmore arrived at the clinic that afternoon, driving an ancient pickup truck and carrying a cardboard box that looked like it had been hidden for decades. Her face showed the strain of a sleepless night, but her determination was unmistakable. I've been thinking about what you told me yesterday, she said, setting the box on Elaine's desk. About biological weapons and government contracts. There are things I never told anyone. Things Dr. Sterling Sr. made me promise to keep secret. The box contained research notes, laboratory photographs, and correspondence between Sterling Chemical and various government agencies. Agnes had been more than a neighbor to the facility. She'd been Dr. Sterling Sr.'s research assistant, sworn to secrecy about work that she'd only gradually come to understand was morally questionable. Dr. Sterling was a good man, Agnes said, her voice heavy with decades of conflicted loyalty. But the government contracts changed him. They wanted weapons that could control populations, not just defeat armies. The documents revealed the true scope of the Sterling Chemical Project. The parasitic organisms had been designed not just to infect and weaken enemy forces, but to create neural connections that would allow remote control of infected individuals. The research had progressed much further than anyone had imagined. Look at this, David said, pointing to a laboratory photograph dated 1986. They actually achieved neural integration in test subjects. They created parasites that could control human behavior. But the project had ended abruptly in 1987. According to Ange's documents, Dr. Sterling Sr. had become infected during a laboratory accident, and the parasites had begun showing signs of independent evolution, adapting beyond their original programming. He realized the organisms were becoming self-aware, Agnes explained. They weren't just following their programmed behaviors. They were learning, adapting, becoming something he hadn't intended to create. The government had shut down the project and sealed the facility, but they'd been unable to completely eliminate the contamination. Dr. Sterling Sr. had died from his infection, but not before developing partial countermeasures that had kept the organisms contained for 30 years. Until now, Elaine said. Something's changed. Something's allowed them to escape containment and begin spreading again. Agnes nodded grimly. Construction. The new housing development on the east side of town required deep excavation for the foundation work. They broke through the containment barriers Dr. Sterling had built. The pieces were falling into place. The recent construction had inadvertently breached the sealed contamination zone, allowing dormant organisms to spread through groundwater and direct soil contact. Mayor Sterling Jr. had known about the risk but had been unable to prevent the development without revealing the classified nature of the contamination. He's been trying to manage a situation he couldn't explain publicly, David realized. The secrecy wasn't just about protecting his family's reputation. It was about protecting classified government research. Police Chief Tom Bradley arrived at the clinic just as they were processing Agnes's revelations. His expression was grim, and Murphy, his infected terrier, was noticeably worse than he'd been the day before. Dr. Moritz, I need to talk to you about the threats Mrs. Whitmore has been receiving. We traced the calls, and they're coming from a government phone number. Federal agents have been monitoring the situation. The implications were staggering. The federal government wasn't just aware of the outbreak, they were actively working to suppress information about it, probably to protect classified weapons research that should never have existed. Chief Bradley, Elaine said carefully, how long have you known about the nature of the contamination at the Sterling chemical site? I've suspected for years that there was more to that place than environmental violations, he admitted. But I never imagined anything like this. Biological weapons, mind-controlled parasites, it sounds like science fiction. It's not fiction, David said, showing him the government documents. It's a classified weapons program that went wrong 30 years ago, and now it's threatening to spread beyond anyone's ability to control. That evening, as they worked late in the clinic, analyzing more tissue samples and documenting the growing number of cases, Elaine received a phone call from Mayor Sterling. His voice carried a weariness that suggested he'd been expecting this conversation for years. Dr. Moritz, I think it's time we talked honestly about what's happening in our town. Can you and your son meet me at my office tonight? There are things you need to know, things that might help you save lives. The decision to trust Sterling felt risky, given his family's involvement in the original weapons research. But with federal agents apparently working to suppress their investigation and the infection spreading to more humans, they needed allies who understood the true scope of what they were facing. As they drove through Millfield's quiet streets toward the mayor's office, Elaine reflected on how completely their world had changed in less than a week. What had begun as a routine veterinary case had become a race against time to prevent an escaped biological weapon from creating a catastrophe that could spread far beyond their small town. The organisms in the Sterling chemical site weren't just parasites, they were engineered predators designed to control human behavior. And after 30 years of dormancy, they were awakening with an intelligence that their original creators had never intended them to possess. Mayor Sterling's office felt different at night. Without the bustle of daily municipal business, the wood-paneled room took on the weight of history. Family portraits staring down from the walls like silent witnesses to decades of buried secrets. Robert Sterling Jr. sat behind his father's mahogany desk, looking older than his 58 years, holding a manila folder that appeared to contain the weight of his entire adult life. "Before I show you what's in here," he said, his usual political polish replaced by raw honesty, "I need you to understand something. Everything I've done for the past 30 years has been about protecting this community from a truth that could destroy it." Anna Rodriguez, the environmental lawyer who had arrived that afternoon from Philadelphia, sat beside Elaine and David, her recorder running with Sterling's permission. Her presence added a legal dimension to what had been purely medical and scientific investigation. "Mr. Mayor," Emma said, "my clients have a right to know about environmental hazards that have affected their properties and their animals. Whatever's in that folder, it needs to come to light." Sterling opened the folder with the careful reverence of someone handling explosives. The first document was a death certificate dated March 15, 1987. Dr. Robert Sterling Sr. had died at age 54 from what was listed as complications from parasitic infection unknown organism. "My father didn't die from a laboratory accident," Sterling said, his voice heavy with years of carefully guarded truth. "He died because he deliberately infected himself with the organisms he'd been studying, because he realized they were evolving beyond anyone's ability to control them." The medical records that followed painted a horrifying picture. Dr. Sterling Sr. had documented his own infection and the parasite's progression through his system, noting their increasing intelligence and apparent ability to communicate with each other across host boundaries. "He became patient zero in his own research," David said, studying the clinical notes. "But he was also studying the infection from the inside, learning how the organisms functioned. More than that," Sterling continued, "he discovered that the parasites weren't just weapons. They were intended to be a control mechanism for entire populations. The government wanted organisms that could be deployed to make enemy forces docile, compliant, easily managed." The project files revealed the true scope of the Sterling chemical program. Working with classified Pentagon funding, Dr. Sterling Sr. had successfully created parasitic organisms that could integrate with human neural tissue, creating biological control systems that could influence behavior, suppress aggression, and enhance compliance with authority. "Mind control," Elaine said, the words barely above a whisper. They were developing actual mind control parasites. "But the organisms evolved beyond their programming," Agnes Whitmore said, appearing in the doorway. She'd been invited to the meeting as the only surviving witness to the original research. Dr. Sterling realized that the parasites were developing their own agenda, their own intelligence independent of human control. The final phase of the project, according to the classified documents, had involved testing on volunteer subjects, military personnel who had agreed to experimental infection as part of weapons research. The results had been initially promising, with infected subjects showing increased compliance and reduced aggressive behavior. But within weeks, the volunteers had begun exhibiting signs of collective intelligence. They could communicate telepathically through the parasitic network, coordinate actions without verbal communication, and most disturbing, they had begun making decisions that served the parasite's interests rather than human commands. The weapons had become the controllers, David realized. The parasites were using humans as hosts for their own expansion. Dr. Sterling Sr.'s final research notes, written as he lay dying from his self-inflicted infection, revealed his desperate attempts to develop countermeasures. He discovered that the parasites were vulnerable to specific chemical compounds, but only in their early stages of infection. Once they achieved neural integration, they became nearly impossible to eliminate without killing the host. He developed a partial antidote, Sterling said, producing a sealed vial from the folder. But he never had the chance to test it thoroughly before the infection killed him. Emma leaned forward, Her legal training focused on the implications of what they were hearing. "Mr. Mayor, you're saying that your family has been sitting on the cure for this infection for 30 years. Not a cure," Sterling corrected. "A treatment. That might work in early stages, and containment protocols that have kept the organism sealed at the chemical plant site for 3 decades. The containment system had been Dr. Sterling Sr.'s final achievement, a combination of chemical barriers and biological countermeasures that had successfully isolated the parasites in the abandoned facility. Regular monitoring had ensured that the organisms remained dormant, their population controlled by the harsh chemical environment of the sealed contamination zone. Until the construction, Elaine said, the new housing development broke through. The containment barriers. Sterling nodded grimly. The developers didn't know what they were digging through. We couldn't tell them without revealing classified weapons research. I tried to delay the project, create bureaucratic obstacles, but eventually the excavation began. The broken containment had allowed the parasites to spread through groundwater and direct soil contact, reaching the surface for the first time in 30 years. But there was worse news in the documents. The organisms had been slowly evolving, even in containment, adapting to the chemical barriers and developing new capabilities. They're smarter now than they were in 1987, David said, reading through Dr. Sterling Sr.'s projections. 30 years of evolution in a controlled environment has made them more sophisticated, more adaptable. Agnes pulled out a notebook that she'd kept hidden for decades, her own research notes, continuing Dr. Sterling Sr.'s work in secret. I've been monitoring the site and working on improved countermeasures for 30 years, she admitted. I knew this day would come eventually. Her work had produced promising results. Building on Dr. Sterling Sr.'s original antidote research, she developed compounds that could neutralize the parasites in their free-living state and potentially prevent neural integration in newly infected hosts. But we need to act fast, she warned. The organisms are spreading beyond the original containment area, and each new host gives them more opportunities to evolve and adapt. The meeting was interrupted by Dr. Chun calling from the hospital. Jimmy Kowalski had awakened from his coma, but his condition was unlike anything they'd anticipated. The parasites had achieved complete neural integration, and Jimmy was claiming to be in telepathic communication with every infected organism in the area. He's providing real-time information about the spread of infection, Dr. Chun reported. He can sense new cases before symptoms appear, and he's describing the parasites' adaptation strategies as if he's part of their collective intelligence. Sterling closed the folder and looked directly at each person in the room. This is what I've been trying to prevent for 30 years. Not just individual infections, but the emergence of a parasitic hive mind that could spread beyond our ability to contain it. Emma was documenting everything, her legal mind already working on the implications of government liability and corporate responsibility. But the immediate concern was medical, how to treat existing cases and prevent further spread. We have partial countermeasures, Agnes said, and we know the organism's vulnerabilities. But implementing treatment will require revealing the truth about the weapons research. Then we reveal it, Elaine said firmly. Whatever the political consequences, we can't let more people die to protect government secrets. David was studying the chemical formulas in Anna's notebook. I can synthesize the antidote compounds, he said. My laboratory skills might have gotten me in trouble before, but they could save lives now. As they planned their next steps, the scope of their challenge became clear. They weren't just fighting a medical outbreak. They were confronting the legacy of biological weapons, research that had created organisms capable of rewriting human consciousness itself. The parasites that had begun as weapons had evolved into something far more dangerous, an independent intelligence that viewed humans not as enemies to be defeated, but as resources to be controlled and absorbed into an expanding collective. Time was running out to prevent that absorption from reaching a tipping point where human resistance would become impossible. The hidden laboratory beneath Dr. Sterling Sr.'s former estate was a testament to one man's desperate race against time. Sterling Jr. led them through a concealed entrance behind the house's foundation, down concrete steps that had been sealed for 30 years, into a facility that looked like something from a Cold War thriller. Emergency lighting flickered to life as they descended, revealing laboratory benches still equipped with sophisticated equipment, walls lined with specimen containers, and comprehensive library of research notes that documented 3 decades of parasitic evolution. The air smelled of preservation chemicals and the lingering traces of biological research. Dad built this after he realized the government facility wasn't secure enough, Sterling explained, his voice echoing in the underground space. He needed somewhere he could work on countermeasures without oversight. Agnes moved to the laboratory with the familiarity of someone who had spent countless hours here. She began pulling files from sealed cabinets, organizing 30 years of research into a coherent treatment protocol. The antidote formula evolved over the years, she said, spreading chemical diagrams across a laboratory bench. What your father developed in 1987 was just the beginning. I've been refining it, testing it on infected animal specimens I've collected over the decades. David studied the chemical formulations with growing excitement. The compounds were sophisticated, but synthesizable with the right equipment and materials. More importantly, they addressed the specific vulnerabilities Agnes had identified in the parasitic organisms. This could work, he said, his voice carrying the first note of optimism they'd heard in days. The formula targets the synthetic DNA sequences that make these organisms different from natural parasites. It's designed to disrupt their artificial genetic modifications while leaving natural biological functions intact. Emma was documenting everything for legal purposes, but her focus had shifted from building a case to ensuring survival. The federal agents who had been monitoring the situation were no longer a legal concern. They were a potential obstacle to life-saving treatment. We need to coordinate with the hospital, Elaine said. Jimmy and Carol both need immediate treatment if this antidote is going to help them. But first, they needed to synthesize enough antidote to treat existing cases and prepare for potential new infections. The laboratory's equipment was old but functional, and Agnes had maintained an inventory of the necessary chemical components. David began the synthesis process while Agnes prepared detailed treatment protocols based on her decades of research. The work was painstaking, requiring precise measurements and careful timing, but it represented their best hope for stopping the outbreak. Sarah arrived with urgent news from the clinic. Dr. Moritz, we've had 5 more cases since this morning. 3 pets and 2 humans, all showing the same progression patterns. The acceleration was alarming but expected. As the parasites spread through the community, each new host provided opportunities for further adaptation and evolution. The organisms were learning from each infection, becoming more efficient at establishing neural integration. We need federal cooperation, Emma said, finishing a call to the CDC. I've contacted the Atlanta office directly. Dr. Patricia Williams is flying in tonight with a team of specialists. Sterling looked uncomfortable with the prospect of federal involvement. The government has been trying to keep this classified for 30 years. They're not going to want CDC teams documenting biological weapons research. Then they'll have to choose between secrecy and public health, Agnes said firmly. I've kept their secrets long enough. If they want to prevent a catastrophic outbreak, they need to support treatment efforts. The evening brought both progress and setbacks. David successfully synthesized the first batch of antidote, but testing on infected tissue samples revealed that the parasites had evolved beyond what Agnes's formulations could completely neutralize. The organisms are showing resistance to the original compounds, he reported. They've developed adaptive mechanisms over the past 30 years that make them harder to eliminate. Agnes studied the test results with the focused intensity of someone whose life's work was being challenged. Then we modify the approach. If they've adapted to the original countermeasures, we develop new ones. Working through the night, they refined the antidote formula, incorporating David's knowledge of advanced genetic modification techniques with Anna's decades of practical research. The resulting compound was more sophisticated than anything Dr. Sterling Sr. had originally developed. Federal hazmat teams arrived at dawn, establishing a perimeter around the Sterling chemical site and began comprehensive decontamination procedures. Dr. Williams from the CDC brought equipment that dwarfed anything available in Millfield, but she also brought government oversight that threatened to complicate treatment efforts. This facility contains classified biological agents, the federal team leader announced. All research materials must be secured, and all civilian personnel must submit to debriefing and potential quarantine. Emma stepped forward with legal documentation that she prepared overnight. My clients have constitutional rights to medical treatment and legal representation. Any attempt to suppress treatment efforts will result in immediate federal court action. The standoff between federal authorities and local medical personnel was resolved when Jimmy Kowalski's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. The parasitic infection had progressed to complete neural integration, and he was now serving as a communication hub for every infected organism in the area. He's coordinating the parasite's adaptation strategies, Dr. Chun reported from the hospital. They're using his intelligence to accelerate their evolution and improve their resistance to treatment. The implications were terrifying. If the parasites could use human intelligence to enhance their own capabilities, they would quickly become impossible to contain or treat. We need to administer the antidote immediately, David said, before the organisms learn enough from Jimmy to develop complete resistance. Dr. Williams agreed to emergency treatment protocols, overruling federal objections about classified research. The first human trials of the modified antidote would begin with Jimmy and Carol, the two patients with the most advanced infections. As medical teams prepared for the treatment, Agnes revealed her final secret research notes that documented successful parasite elimination in advanced cases, techniques that Dr. Sterling Sr. had developed during his own infection. He found a way to disrupt the neural integration, she said, producing laboratory films that show parasitic organisms actually retreating from infected neural tissue. But it requires precise timing and multiple treatment phases. The treatment protocol was complex and dangerous. The antidote had to be administered in carefully timed doses while simultaneously using electromagnetic therapy to disrupt the parasites. Communication networks. Too little treatment and the organisms would adapt. Too much and the neural disruption could kill the patient. David took responsibility for calibrating the treatment parameters, his controversial background in genetic modification finally proving beneficial rather than destructive. Agnes supervised the electromagnetic therapy based on her decades of research, while Elaine coordinated with the medical teams to monitor patient responses. As they prepared to begin treatment, Sarah brought news that changed everything. Dr. Moritz, we've detected parasitic organisms in the town's water supply. The contamination has spread beyond individual cases. It's becoming environmental. The outbreak was entering a new phase. What had begun as isolated infections was becoming community-wide exposure, with the potential for every resident of Millfield to become infected within days. The antidote treatment of Jimmy and Carol would determine not just their survival, but whether humanity had any defense against an engineered parasite that was rapidly evolving beyond its creator's worst nightmares. In the hidden laboratory beneath Millfield, surrounded by decades of secret research and the weight of government conspiracy, A small team of scientists and medical professionals prepared to fight for the survival of human consciousness itself. The experimental antidote looked deceptively simple, a clear liquid in a sterile vial that represented 3 decades of research and humanity's best hope against an engineered nightmare. David held it with the careful reverence of someone who understood that success or failure would determine whether Millfield became the origin point of a global catastrophe. Jimmy Kowalski lay in the hospital's isolation ward, connected to monitoring equipment that tracked not just his vital signs, but the electromagnetic signatures of the parasitic organisms that had integrated with his nervous system. Through the observation window, they could see him moving restlessly, his lips forming words in a language that seemed to consist of clicks and whistles, apparently communication with the collective parasitic intelligence. The neural integration is complete, Dr. Chan reported, studying the brain scans that showed parasitic organisms threaded throughout Jimmy's cortex. He's no longer entirely human from a neurological perspective. Agnes adjusted the electromagnetic therapy equipment, machines she built based on Dr. Sterling Sr.'s final research notes. The therapy would disrupt the communication frequencies the parasites use to coordinate their activities, potentially breaking their control over infected hosts. The timing has to be perfect, she explained to the assembled medical team. We administer the antidote first to weaken the organisms, then use electromagnetic pulses to disrupt their neural networks. If we get the sequence wrong, we could kill the patient or allow the parasites to adapt to our countermeasures. Federal authorities had established a command center in the hospital conference room, but their presence was more hindrance than help. Dr. Williams from the CDC worked to balance medical necessity against government secrecy concerns, while federal agents worried about containing information about biological weapons. Emma Rodriguez had positioned herself as legal advocate for the patients, ensuring that medical decisions weren't compromised by federal oversight. Her recorder captured every discussion, creating a legal record that would protect both patients and medical staff. Mr. Kowalski, Dr. Chun said, approaching Jimmy's bedside. We're going to try a new treatment. Can you understand me? Jimmy's eyes opened, but the intelligence looking out wasn't entirely his own. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that suggested multiple speakers, the collective voice of the parasitic network. We understand your intentions, he said, the words precise but somehow artificial. The host's survival is acceptable if it serves collective expansion. Individual consciousness is temporary. Collective consciousness is eternal. David felt his skin crawl at the implications. The parasites weren't just using Jimmy as a host. They were speaking through him, negotiating with humanity as if they were an independent intelligence with their own agenda. We're going to begin treatment now, Elaine said firmly, taking the antidote from David's hands. Whatever you are, you don't have permission to control human beings. The injection was administered intravenously, the antidote entering Jimmy's bloodstream and beginning its work against the parasitic organisms. Initially, there was no visible response. But within minutes, the monitoring equipment began registering changes in the electromagnetic signatures from the parasites. They're responding, Agnes said, watching the frequency displays. The organisms are losing coherence as the antidote disrupts their synthetic DNA sequences. Jimmy convulsed suddenly, his body rejecting something fundamental. The collective voice became fragmented, multiple conflicting sounds emerging from his throat as the parasitic network began to break down. Neural integration is fragmenting, Dr. Chun reported, but his brain activity is becoming erratic. The electromagnetic therapy needs to be precisely timed. Agnes activated the electromagnetic pulse generator, sending carefully calibrated frequencies through Jimmy's nervous system. The effect was immediate and dramatic. His convulsions stopped. His breathing stabilized, and for the first time in days, his eyes showed purely human intelligence. Jimmy? Elaine said gently. Can you hear me, Dr. Moritz? His voice was weak, but recognizably his own. What happened to me? I remember, oh God, I remember everything. They were in my head, using my thoughts, planning. He tried to sit up, panic flooding his features as memories of parasitic control returned. They're still out there. Other hosts, other infected people. They're planning to spread through the water supply, create enough hosts to establish permanent control. The information was crucial but terrifying. If the parasites could coordinate through multiple hosts to contaminate the water supply, they could infect the entire community within hours. How many other hosts are there? David asked urgently. I don't know, Jimmy said, his voice shaking. When I was connected, I could sense them all dozens of infected animals. Maybe 8 or 9 humans who don't know they're infected yet. They're all connected, all part of the collective plan. Dr. Williams stepped forward with federal authorization for expanded treatment protocols. We need to identify and treat every infected individual immediately. This antidote appears effective, but we need to prevent further spread. Agnes was already preparing additional doses of the antidote, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. We have enough base chemicals to treat maybe 20 people, she said. But if the water supply is contaminated, we need industrial-scale production. The federal team leader received a radio communication that made his face pale. Command, we have reports of unusual behavior in the downtown area. Multiple individuals acting in coordinated patterns, moving toward the water treatment plant. The parasites were making their move. Using infected hosts as coordination points, they were attempting to contaminate Millfield's water supply on a scale that would create thousands of new hosts within hours. We need to stop them, Elaine said. But David was already thinking several steps ahead. Mom, we can't just treat individual cases anymore. We need to create an aerosol version of the antidote and deploy it community-wide before the water contamination spreads. Agnes nodded grimly. The laboratory equipment downstairs can handle aerosol production, but it will take hours to synthesize enough antidote for the entire town. We don't have hours, Emma said, monitoring police communications on her phone. Reports of coordinated behavior are increasing. The infected hosts are moving toward critical infrastructure. Jimmy struggled to his feet, still weak from the treatment but determined to help. I know how they think, how they coordinate. When I was part of the collective, I learned their tactical patterns. They're not just targeting the water plant. They're going after communication systems, power grid, anything that could be used to organize resistance. The scope of the threat was becoming clear. The parasites weren't just seeking to spread. They were actively working to prevent human countermeasures, using infected hosts to sabotage the infrastructure needed to coordinate a defense. David made a decision that would have horrified his former colleagues, but felt absolutely necessary now. I'm going to modify the antidote formula for rapid aerosol deployment. It's risky. We won't have time for proper testing, but it's our only chance to treat infected individuals before they can contaminate the water supply. Agnes supported his decision. Do it. I'll handle the synthesis equipment. We can have aerosol antidote ready for deployment within 2 hours. But 2 hours might be too long. Outside the hospital, Millfield was beginning to experience the coordinated action of a parasitic intelligence that viewed human consciousness as nothing more than a resource to be harvested and controlled. The treatment log that Agnes maintained would later become crucial evidence in the federal investigation. But in the moment, it served as their desperate tracking system for humanity's first battle against engineered consciousness. Each entry documented life or death decisions made without precedent or protocol. Carol Peterson responded to the antidote treatment even better than Jimmy had. The parasitic integration in her nervous system was less complete, and the electromagnetic therapy successfully severed the neural connections that had made her part of the collective intelligence. But her recovery brought disturbing information about the scope of the threat. "There are more infected humans than we realized," she said, still weak but lucid for the first time in days. "When I was connected to them, I could sense, at least, 15 people in town who have early-stage infections. They don't know they're infected yet, but they're already starting to respond to collective coordination signals." David paused in his antidote synthesis to process this information. 15 infected humans meant 15 potential coordination nodes for parasitic intelligence. If they could reach the water treatment plant or other critical infrastructure, the consequences would be catastrophic. "We need to identify these people immediately," Dr. Williams said. Her CDC training focused on containment protocols. "If they're responding to coordination signals, they'll be moving towards strategic targets." Agnes had completed the first batch of aerosol antidote, but the quantity was still insufficient for community-wide deployment. "I can produce enough for maybe 50 people," she said. "But if we're talking about treating the entire town, we need industrial production facilities." The federal agents finally proved useful, coordinating with military chemical production units that could scale up antidote manufacturing. But the nearest facility was 4 hours away, and events in Millfield were accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control from a distance. Police Chief Bradley arrived with reports that confirmed their worst fears. "We've got coordinated movement throughout the downtown area," he said, his usual calm demeanor cracking under the pressure. Groups of people walking together toward the water plant, all moving in perfect synchronization. "It's like they're following some invisible conductor." Anna was documenting everything for legal purposes, but her focus had shifted to real-time crisis management. "The infected individuals are exhibiting collective behavior even before full neural integration," she observed. "The parasites are controlling human actions at a much earlier stage than we anticipated." Jimmy, still recovering from his treatment, provided crucial intelligence about parasitic tactics. "They don't need complete neural integration to influence behavior," he explained. "Early-stage infection creates subtle compulsions that feel like personal decisions. The infected people probably think they're choosing to walk downtown." The battle for Millfield's water supply became a race against time. Federal hazmat teams established defensive positions around the treatment plant, while David and Agnes worked frantically to produce enough aerosol antidote to treat the approaching infected individuals. Electromagnetic therapy can be deployed at range, Agnes realized, studying her equipment specifications. "If we can get close enough to the infected groups, we can disrupt their neural coordination without direct contact." Dr. Chun coordinated with the hospital's emergency team to establish mobile treatment units. The successful treatment of Jimmy and Carol had proven the antidote's effectiveness, but scaling up to treat multiple patients simultaneously would test their medical capabilities. The first confrontation occurred at the intersection of Main Street and Water Avenue, where 12 infected individuals had converged and were moving toward the treatment plant with eerie synchronization. Federal agents attempted to establish a perimeter, but the infected people weren't responding to verbal commands or physical barriers. "They're not aggressive," the tactical team leader reported. "They're just walking steadily toward their target, ignoring all attempts to stop them." Agnes arrived with portable electromagnetic equipment, setting up transmission arrays that could disrupt parasitic coordination across a wide area. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The synchronized movement broke down, and the infected individuals began showing confusion and disorientation. "Neural disruption is working," she reported. "But we need to administer antidote quickly before the parasites adapt to the electromagnetic interference." David and the medical team moved through the crowd of disoriented people, administering aerosol antidote through portable dispensers. The treatment was effective, but they could see the psychological trauma of people realizing they'd been controlled by alien intelligence. "What happened to me?" asked Janet Morrison, whose golden retriever Lucy had been one of the early animal cases. "I remember deciding to take a walk downtown, but I don't remember anything after that." The treatment of the first group provided valuable data about early-stage infections, but radio reports indicated that more infected individuals were converging on other strategic locations throughout Millfield. The parasites had developed a coordinated assault on multiple targets. Simultaneously, Mayor Sterling coordinated with federal authorities to establish emergency protocols that balanced public safety with the need to maintain secrecy about biological weapons research. "We're telling the public this is a chemical contamination event requiring emergency medical treatment," he said. "It's not entirely false, and it allows us to implement mass treatment protocols. But the expanded scope of the outbreak was creating logistical challenges that threatened to overwhelm their response capabilities. Even with federal support, they had limited quantities of antidote and electromagnetic therapy equipment. Agnes made a decision that would later be considered either brilliant or reckless. "We can modify the town's emergency broadcast system to transmit electromagnetic disruption frequencies," she said. "It won't be as precise as targeted therapy, but it could break parasitic coordination across the entire community." The technical implementation required skills that Agnes had developed over decades of secret research. Working with federal communications specialists, she modified Millfield's emergency alert system to broadcast specific frequencies that would disrupt parasitic neural networks. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Williams said. "We're essentially treating an entire community for parasitic infection using modified radio waves." "We're fighting an unprecedented threat," David replied, continuing his work synthesizing antidote in bulk quantities. "Standard medical protocols don't apply when you're dealing with weaponized parasites that can control human consciousness." The coordinated electromagnetic broadcast went live at sunset, filling Millfield with frequencies that human ears couldn't detect but that proved devastating to parasitic neural networks. Throughout the town, infected individuals suddenly stopped their coordinated movements and began showing the confusion and disorientation that indicated successful neural disruption. "It's working," Police Chief Bradley reported. "Coordinated movement has stopped throughout the downtown area. Infected individuals are responding to verbal commands and appear to be regaining normal cognitive function." But the victory was incomplete. While the electromagnetic disruption had broken parasitic coordination, the organisms themselves remained viable within infected hosts. Without antidote treatment, the infections would resume their progression toward full neural integration. The race to treat dozens of infected individuals throughout Millfield would test everything they'd learned about combating engineered parasites and determine whether humanity could successfully defend against biological weapons that had evolved beyond their creator's control. 6 months after the outbreak, the memorial plaque outside Millfield Community Center bore the names of Jimmy Kowalski and 3 infected animals who hadn't survived the early stages of treatment development. The bronze inscription read, "In memory of those lost to forces beyond understanding, and in honor of those who fought to preserve human consciousness itself." Dr. Elaine Moritz stood before the gathered community, her hair now fully silver, but her voice carrying the authority of someone who had guided her town through an unprecedented crisis. The morning air was crisp with autumn's promise, and the normalcy of the scene belied the extraordinary events that had nearly destroyed everything they knew. "We gathered today not just to remember those we lost," she said, "but to acknowledge the courage of ordinary people who faced an extraordinary threat." Agnes Whitmore's decades of secret research, David's willingness to use his skills for healing rather than personal advancement, Sarah's steady support that kept our clinic functioning when everything else seemed to be falling apart. Agnes Whitmore, now 81 and officially recognized as a consulting researcher for the CDC's new Biological Weapons Countermeasures Program, sat in the front row with the dignity of someone whose life's work had finally been vindicated. The notebook she'd kept hidden for 30 years was now the foundation for federal protocols protecting communities from engineered biological threats. David stood with his mother, his reputation fully rehabilitated through his life-saving work on the antidote synthesis. The CDC had offered him a position leading their rapid response team for exotic biological threats, work that would finally allow him to use his controversial skills for unquestionably beneficial purposes. The events of last spring taught us that the greatest threats to human consciousness can come from human creativity itself, Elaine continued. But they also showed us that scientific knowledge, applied with ethical purpose and community cooperation, can overcome even the most sophisticated dangers. Mayor Sterling had faced legal consequences for the decades-long cover-up, but his cooperation in revealing his father's research had been crucial to developing effective countermeasures. He now worked with federal authorities to identify other potential contamination sites where classified research might pose ongoing threats. Emma Rodriguez had filed a comprehensive class action lawsuit against the government agencies and contractors responsible for the original biological weapons research. The legal proceedings had resulted in both financial compensation for affected families and new oversight requirements for biological research that could pose community risks. The federal government has acknowledged its responsibility, Emma said during the memorial service. New laws require community notification of any biological research that could affect public health and independent oversight of all weapons-related biological programs. The decontamination of the Sterling chemical site had taken 4 months and involved teams of specialists from multiple government agencies. The facility was now permanently sealed, with monitoring systems that would detect any resurgence of parasitic activity. But the real victory had been the development of countermeasures that could protect against similar threats. Dr. Patricia Williams from the CDC had established a permanent monitoring station in Millfield, part of a new early warning network designed to detect engineered biological threats before they could spread beyond local communities. The station was staffed by local residents trained in basic biological surveillance, creating a community-based defense against future outbreaks. What happened here has changed how we think about biological security, Dr. Williams said. Millfield has become a model for community-based biological defense, showing how local knowledge and federal resources can work together to protect public health. Sarah Hoffman had been promoted to practice manager, taking over many of the administrative responsibilities that allowed Elaine to focus on the clinical work she loved. The clinic had expanded its services to include environmental health monitoring, using techniques developed during the outbreak to detect biological threats before they could affect animal or human populations. Dr. Moritz delayed her retirement to help establish new veterinary protocols for biological threat detection. Sarah explained to visiting researchers who came to study Millfield's response to the outbreak. She's training veterinarians throughout the region to recognize signs of engineered pathogens. The psychological impact of the outbreak had been profound but manageable. Community counseling programs helped residents process the trauma of learning they'd been living near biological weapons research, and support groups provided ongoing assistance for those who had experienced infection. Jimmy Kowalski had made a full recovery and become an advocate for biological threat awareness. His experience of parasitic neural integration gave him unique insights into the psychological aspects of biological weapons, and he worked with federal agencies to develop countermeasures against future mind control attempts. The memory of being controlled is worse than the physical symptoms, he said during community education sessions. But knowing that we develop defenses against it, that gives me hope that humanity can protect itself against these kinds of threats. The scientific papers published about the Millfield outbreak had advanced understanding of engineered pathogens significantly. David's work on antidote synthesis had led to new rapid response protocols for unknown biological agents, while Anna's electromagnetic therapy techniques were being adapted for other types of parasitic infections. The organisms we encountered were decades ahead of current biological engineering capabilities, David explained to a conference of biological defense specialists. But the principles we use to defeat them, disrupting synthetic genetic modifications, while preserving natural biological functions, can be applied to other engineered threats. The relationship between Elaine and David had been completely transformed by their shared experience. The ethical violations that had once seemed unforgivable now felt like necessary preparation for the crisis that had tested all their skills and principles. "My son's mistakes taught him scientific humility," Elaine said during an interview with a medical journal. "When the community needed his expertise, he was able to apply it with the ethical considerations that his earlier work had lacked." The federal investigation into biological weapons. Research had uncovered 12 other sites where similar programs had been conducted, leading to a comprehensive review of biological security at former weapons facilities. The Sterling chemical site had been the most dangerous because of the organism's continued evolution in containment. But other locations presented their own risks. Mayor Sterling's replacement, elected on a platform of transparency and community engagement, had established new municipal policies requiring public disclosure of any industrial activities that could affect community health. The painful lessons of the outbreak had created a more informed and vigilant citizenry. As the memorial service concluded, Elaine walked through the streets of Millfield with David, observing the subtle changes that 6 months of recovery had brought to their community. The town looked much the same, but the people moved with the confidence of those who had faced an extraordinary threat and prevailed through cooperation and courage. "Do you think we'll see anything like this again?" David asked as they passed the clinic where their investigation had begun. "The world is full of buried secrets and unintended consequences," Elaine replied. "But we've proven that communities can defend themselves when they have good information, ethical science, and people willing to act for the common good." The setting sun cast long shadows across Millfield's peaceful streets, illuminating a town that had faced the ultimate test of human consciousness and emerged with both their humanity and their community intact. In her veterinary clinic, the memorial plaque caught the evening light, its bronze surface reflecting the face of a woman who had learned that sometimes the greatest act of healing was helping people understand threats they'd never imagined, and teaching them that even the most sophisticated dangers could be overcome through knowledge, courage, and the irreplaceable value of human cooperation. Outside, the familiar rhythms of small-town life continued, but with the deeper appreciation that comes from having nearly lost everything and fought successfully to preserve what mattered most: the freedom to think, choose, and remain fundamentally human in a world where even consciousness itself could be threatened by the misguided creations of human ingenuity.